I was saying the Plants for Birds program brings together conservation, education, and policy. So the conservation is obvious. You're taking conservation on the ground to create habitat for birds. The education piece comes with things like this, where we get to share that. So even when you make those changes in your garden, you will have the opportunity to talk to folks about why you're putting native plants in the ground and why that's so important. And then the policy piece, National Audubon has really shifted their focus with the Plants for Birds program from getting 1 million plants in the ground to really focusing on passing proclamations, resolutions, and ordinances. So, if you're changing your yard, that's great, but if you can get together with folks and make some changes about how the city or your town is making decisions about purchasing native plants, that's really going to have a bigger impact at scale. So if you National Audubon, you're going to be seeing more of that from them. So just a brief overview on my presentation. I'm going to be talking about why native plants matter. What are the threats? What are the solutions? We'll be going over the 4 plant groups that birds have, what birds need in every season, and then I'll be taking a closer look at the Plants for Birds database. And how many of you are familiar with the Plants for Birds database, have used that? All right, well, that's good. It's a good opportunity for education right here then. So when we're thinking about birds, we really think about the big picture, and we think about migration flyways. In our strategic plans, that's how we're really thinking. And we need to be protecting birds everywhere throughout their lives. And so your yard, your property is an opportunity to provide habitats for migratory birds as they're migrating through, as well as for breeding birds and overwintering birds who are here. Even though our backyards are kind of like private oases, those little spots there, when they're taken together, they really connect and create a bigger impact of change in habitat. So I imagine you're familiar with Audubon's climate report that came out in the fall, Survival by Degrees, which showed that 2/3 of North American birds are at risk of extinction from climate change. And that the good side news of that is that if we are able to slow the rate of climate change to a 1.5 degrees Celsius scenario rather than 3, 2/3 of those, more than half of those birds are going to be able to be off that list. But at this point, 389 species of the 604 bird species in North America are at risk. Other threats to birds is our household cats. They're, according to the most current research, free-roaming outdoor cats are estimated to kill between 1.3 billion and 3.9 billion birds every year. And I recently was reading an article online about the shift that has taken place about how we treat dogs and how we care for dogs. And it used to be 30 years ago that you would just let your dogs roam free. They'd come home when they wanted to, like we do now for cats. And that doesn't happen now with dogs. And a similar thing could happen with cats. There could be a culture shift about how people look at cats, how they care for cats. It's safer for cats to leave them indoors, and it has a huge impact on wildlife. The other threat you see right there are window collisions, of course, and it's estimated that 1 billion birds per year are killed with window collisions. So things like the Lights Outs program can help, and in your own home, putting anything that's going to break up that reflective surface of the glass is going to be helpful for the birds. And placing your bird feeders closer to the windows so that they don't get like a running start when they're coming. It's going to be, they'll be able to survive if they bump into those windows. And then the other thing that you can do is thinking about pesticides in your yard. So if we're killing the insects, then those aerial insectivores are not going to be able to make a living. They're not going to be able to find their food. And this is from the Cornell report, their decline of North American avifauna. Nearly 3 billion birds are gone since 1970, and aerial insectivores are particularly hard hit. 2 out of 5 barn swallows have been lost since 1970. And, you know, really over the past century, we have taken what was once a very rich, contiguous landscape with just native plants that was ecologically diverse and transformed it into a sterile monoculture. 54% of the US land has been developed into this suburban-urban matrix. And the plants that are planted in these types of scenarios are approximately 80% non-native. And these suburban and urban areas are really critical for birds when they're migrating and when they're breeding. And we can make a change to transform that into something a lot more productive. And restoring those native plants means we're going to have more birds, more butterflies, and more flowers in our lives. And we're really asking more of our gardens. We're not just asking them to be pretty. We're asking them to hold on to the soil. We're asking them to do their work with carbon sequestration, with stormwater management, and then with creating habitat for wildlife. And so you go from just planting something that makes you happy to really planting something that's meaningful and something that's going to help out in your yard. Are folks familiar with Douglas Tallamy's book, Bringing Nature Home? It's an amazing read. And it's all about transforming your yard to support birds. And he really focuses, he's done his research on insects in particular, and I'll get into that in more detail a little later. But when you're doing that, you want to provide birds with the food, water, shelter, and places to nest in your yard. And you're wanting to think in every season that they're going to have all those things that they need to survive. So the 4 native plant groups for birds that we're going to be talking about, number 1 is insects, which is kind of funny when I'm talking about plants for birds. But that is the most essential food for birds that is out there. And it's the protein in the insects that's really essential for birds. The second food group is berries and fruits. Those are going to provide sugar, fat, and antioxidants. Nectar is particularly helpful for the hummingbirds, and that's going to give you sugars. And then the nuts and seeds provide protein and fat and are available year-round in most cases. So that first food group, the insects, and it's the most compelling story for why we want to put native plants out there. And the most interesting story is about the Carolina chickadee. So the Carolina chickadee weighs only 0.35 ounces, and which is approximately the weight of 2 nickels or a French fry. So very tiny bird. But when a chickadee has a nest full of nestlings, that pair of chickadees needs to bring between 390 and 570 caterpillars to the nest every single day. And Doug Tallamy is the one who counted this. So I was giving this talk earlier this week, and they're like, how'd you know that? He actually had his research students out there counting the number of times the Carolina chickadees were coming back to the nest with caterpillars. So doing the math, so chickadees feed their young in the nest for 16 days before they fledge. So that works out to over 9,000 caterpillars that they need to successfully raise a nest full of chickadees. And so where do the caterpillars get those, chickadees get the caterpillars? It's from trees. And looking at the difference between oaks and ginkgos, which are non-native, oaks are host to 557 different species of caterpillars. And they are the best tree species for for being the hosts of caterpillars. And I'll give you a list of other trees that host other caterpillars. Ginkgos, by contrast, support just 5 species of caterpillar. So when you're a bird and you are needing that protein-rich source of food, this is going to be a life-saving difference. And it takes energy to go out hunting for those caterpillars. So you're going to be going to that oak tree, and if you find an oak tree in that yard instead of a ginkgo, then you got it made. And please, if you have any questions as I'm going along, please feel free to raise your hand, and I'd be happy. I'd really like this to be a conversation as well. So can everybody see? Yep. There are quite a few different species of oaks, absolutely. And that kind of gets into what I'm about to talk about, is that insects co-evolved with their host species over millions of years. And so, yes, there are many different species of oaks, but there's also many different species, not of ginkgo, but like of other, of the plants as well. And so those native insects and native plants are really adapted to feed on those plant species, which dominate our traditional urban and suburban landscapes. But the ones that you would find in the nurseries that were bred to be pest-free, they're going to be unpalatable to insects. And they're not going to be the host. They're very much specialists when it comes to what they can eat. So they're not going to be able to survive with those non-native plants. So specialization is key. So 90% of the insects that eat plants can only eat the plants with which they have co-evolved. So when you're thinking, when you're thinking about species diversity, the insect species diversity is really taking a hit as well. So, and if we have those native plants out there, they have a lot better chance of surviving. Let's see here. So here, as I was saying, here there's the top 10 list of the best native trees for caterpillars. Oak is right at the top of the list with 557. Willows, cherries, birches, crab apples, blueberries, which, not really a tree, maples, pines, and hickories. So here's an interesting caterpillar example. So this is the bird dropping mimic. And this bird dropping mimic, its host plant is willow. And when it goes through metamorphosis, it turns into the Viceroy Butterfly, which is a mimic of the monarch. So if you want to see Viceroy butterflies in your garden, you need to plant those willows. And if you want to feed the birds, then they're going to eat the caterpillars. So plants in the cherry family are also a wonderful host species for caterpillars. 456 species of caterpillars for the genus Prunus. And cherries do double duty, of course. You can see the fruit as well as the insects the birds can eat. And native cherries in Vermont are the black cherry, the choke cherry, pin cherry, and sand plum. And you might see in the nurseries, you might see Japanese cherries, and you would want to avoid those because they don't have those insects that have co-evolved. Another great tree out there are birch trees, very popular in the landscape. And the birch seeds are a really great source of food for birds in the winter. I have 3 birch trees in my backyard right now, and it's on top of the snow. It's just scattered with birch seeds. It's amazing, the sheer number of seeds. They're not very old trees either. And birches host over 400 species of caterpillars. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Oh, yes. Yeah. Right, so there are 3 different species of non-native invasive maples that we have in Vermont. The amber maple, which is a smallish tree. And then there's the hedge maple, which you don't see that moving in as an invasive as much, but you see it planted ornamentally. And then Norway maple. I'm sure folks are familiar with the Norway maple. So not only does it have a huge seed bank, but the roots are also allelopathic, which means that it kills off any other plants that are near the roots. So it can't. I mean, it has very dark shade, very deep shade, the Norway maple. So I've actually seen in suburban settings grass struggling to grow under Norway maples as well. So here's our second food group. Moving on, insects. Sorry. is the berries and the fruit. So as I was saying, those are going to be particularly important for fall migration because most of the berries are going to be fruiting becoming ripe in the summertime. And native trees and shrubs produce berries that are higher in energy and fat content. And that's really important for birds to build up those fat reserves before they go on their fall migration journey. And a recent study by Susan Smith found that migratory songbirds consumed fruit from native plants like this dogwood at a faster rate than fruits from invasive plants, and that those fruits from the native plants provided a higher nutritional value to migrating birds than those invasive plants. Yes? That was a wood thrush, I believe. Yep. I have a wood thrush later that'll be singing. So speaking of invasive plants, the first thing when you're thinking about shrubs in your garden, when you're looking at your landscape, is to look at those invasives. So not only are the fruits lower in nutritional value, but some fruits, like the common buckthorn here, are actually harmful to birds. So the Latin name for common buckthorn is Rhamnus cathartica. So cathartic just passes right through the birds. So if you ever, if you're walking along and you see a buckthorn shrub or tree and all the purple underneath, that's because the birds have been feeding and it's just passing right through them. Yes. Oh yeah. There is a native bittersweet. But and I believe it is available to buy in the nursery. It's probably pretty hard to find. But Oriental bittersweet or Asiatic bittersweet, you'll see it snaking around the trunks of trees, and it just strangles them. So as the tree trunk gets bigger, it can't. The cambium or the vascular tissue comes in contact with that strangling vine, and it takes them down. And then it scrambles over top. It's really quite the invader. There is a native honeysuckle as well, yep. But there are, and the way you can tell in the landscape the difference between the native and the invasive honeysuckles, when you cut a stem of the honeysuckle that is invasive, it's hollow stem, whereas the native is solid stemmed. Burning bush, you probably know from as an ornamental, and there's a lot of great alternatives in native plants instead of planting the burning bush. Let's see, and then the state of Vermont there is a list of invasive plants that can no longer be sold in the nursery trade. And a great resource down at the bottom, the vtinvasives.org, has a lot of good information, not only about plant identification, but also about management recommendations. All right. So, shifting gears over to those native fruits. The blueberry right here, most berries do ripen in the summer, which is great food for those adult birds when they're needing to feed their young before they migrate. And they're also defending their territories. So blueberry is on the top 10 list for caterpillars as well. So you're getting sort of double duty in the food. Serviceberry right here, you can see it in blossom on the left. And then the berries, anybody ever tasted serviceberry? Eaten serviceberry? They're delicious if you get to them before the birds. And they're really easy to identify. They're not too hard to confuse with anything else. Shadbush, yep. Serviceberry, shadbush, shadblow, amalanchier is its Latin name. You sometimes hear it called that. Birds love them. You can see the cedar waxwing down in the corner here. And typically, once they're fully in fruit, the birds will tell each other about it, and the tree will be stripped in a day. So flocks of robins will come through, or cedar waxwing, starlings. Oh yes, yeah. You can see here the pinky red color that's pretty tart, and then that dark purpley color is really sweet, and it's pretty rare to be able to get that. And there are different species of serviceberry, and some are sweeter than others. So you got to go around town and taste them. All right. There we go. So there's the wood thrush. And the wood thrush is kind of the poster bird for rapidly declining neotropical migrants. Their population has declined 55% over the past 50 years. And 41% of all neotropical migrant species, songbirds, are declining. So a lot of these songbirds migrate at nighttime, and that migration is fueled by their body fat. And so in the morning, when they're exhausted and they need to rest, and they stop for fuel, if they land in your yard and you've got a privet hedge, they're out of luck. But if they land in your yard and you've got spicebush there, then they've got it made, because those berries are 50% fat. So they don't have to eat nearly as many of those to fuel up for that next leg of their migration journey. And for the spicebush, you need both the male and the female to get berries. So you want to plant at least 4 of those. Let's see here. And here we have Winterberry holly. It's another great fruit for migrating birds. The great thing about this, it's named Winterberry, the fruit persists all winter long. So not only is it good for the songbirds in the fall, but if the berries don't all get eaten on that spring migration, those berries are going to be available again as they come through. And this is another plant that you need the male and female, and so you would want to plant a number of those as well. Another shrub that I really like in the landscape is staghorn sumac. And the birds really don't like those in the fall, but in the springtime, boy, they're like, yeah, that's the best food I've ever had, because there's nothing else out there. It's not like they can go get the blueberries and the serviceberries in the spring. The other important winter fruit are evergreens, conifers. So here's the eastern red cedar with a cedar waxwing. And these berries are extremely high in fat content. So birds like waxwings, bluebirds, robins, thrashers, and goldfinches all love this plant. And then the other thing, being evergreen, it provides cover for birds and shelter year-round. Especially on a night like this, that's really important for birds. I can't silence my phone. So here's our third food group, is the nectar. And of course the hummingbirds are the ones that are going to need the nectar. And the flowers that are the classic hummingbird flowers are these long tubular shaped flowers. And here's the cardinal flower with the ruby-throated hummingbird. And the ruby-throated hummingbird has a 500-mile non-stop journey across the Gulf of Mexico. So if you think about the kind of fat reserves that bird needs to make it across, it's really essential that they're building that up by having lots of native plants out there. Not all hummingbird plants are red. Here's our native jewelweed, which is one of the very few native annual flowers. And this is the yellow jewelweed. And here we have the orange jewelweed with hummingbird right in there. And then in spring migration, there are flowers like columbine and other early blooming wildflowers will really be important for the hummingbirds as they're coming back from their wintering grounds. And the columbine blooms in April and May. They're not as good, no. And some, I know that some are, a lot of plants that are bred for the nursery trade are bred for, like double petals or, having showy colors. And they're really not thinking about what is that food value for wildlife. So if you go with the native plants, you know that it's going to be something that co-evolved with the animals that depend upon it. And they are harder to find. And hummingbirds are great pollinators. And they pollinate 160 different native plants in North America. And when, I've sort of moved on beyond that. When you're planting native plants for hummingbirds, you want to plant patches in different parts of your yard because hummingbirds are quite territorial. And so that's why you can support, you have had that experience? So you can support more hummingbirds if you have them spaced away from each other. So the other thing you want to be thinking about is planting for pollinators. And flowers like the purple coneflower, the New England aster, Joe Pye weed, and orange milkweed are wonderful as providing nectar for butterflies and other pollinators. And then moving on to our fourth food group, the nuts and the seeds. And these are going to provide long-lasting sources of food throughout the winter. So here's a classic nut bird, the blue jay. So the blue jay stashes acorns, hides them till springtime. And this blue jay right here looks like it has just one acorn that it's carrying in its beak, which is carrying in its beak, but they're capable of carrying 5 acorns at once. They have a pouch in their throat where they can stash the acorns. And I think it's to the side so it doesn't choke them. And they can cache between 3,000 and 5,000 acorns in one season. So you think about what's that doing in the landscape. And you know, it's between the blue jays and the squirrels, they really are responsible for planting most of our forests and oaks. And blue jays also gather and hide beech nuts, hazelnuts, and hickory nuts. And then, you know, thinking back to earlier on, oak trees, that's also your number one tree species for caterpillars. So here we have pine trees. In addition to being a great caterpillar host plant, pines are also a great source of nuts. And a group of birds that's very closely tied to those pines are the crossbills, exactly. And they get their name from their very specialized beaks that are adapted to pry open those pine cones to get at the seed that's under the scales. Wait a second. And so when you're thinking about which trees you want to put in your garden, I would recommend that you think about the insects first, that top 10 list of insect host plants, and then consider those seeds and nuts. So some great plants for seeds and nuts are the American beech, any of the oak species. We have shagbark and bitternut hickory are wonderful. We have American and beaked hazelnut, which are native in Vermont. Both the American and slippery elm, American hornbeam, otherwise known as musclewood, the ash species, we can still keep planting them even though they're emerald ash borer. Maple species and birch species are also good sources of nuts and seeds. Black walnut. It might be a little big for the birds to eat. I don't know. Have you seen it? Yeah, I think of it being more, like the small mammals being able to eat it, and the deer. Very hard nuts, yes. I would think that it would support a lot of insects, absolutely. So I wouldn't discourage you from planting any native trees, but I'm not sure that the walnuts would be a good source of food for the birds. Oh, okay. It's not going anywhere. That's wonderful. And then thinking on a smaller scale for seeds are the perennials. So here you see the American goldfinch on a purple coneflower. And when you're gardening in the fall, it's really great to just be a lazy gardener, really, is the big message, is leave those plants up so those seed heads can feed the birds. And then don't do a lot of raking either, because the seeds are going to fall to the ground, and then the birds are going to come along and forage for both insects and seeds as well. Let me see here. And so here we have the palm warbler on goldenrod, and this plant to the right is little blue stem. And these, if you invite plants like this into your yard, then you're going to have birds coming to feed throughout the winter on those seeds. So when you're thinking about planting your garden, you really want to think in those layers, like the layers of the forest. So you want to look at what you have there and think about what's missing. And look at that overstory, that canopy of trees. That's where there's some canopy nesting birds that are going to be able to make their living up there. In the mid-story, that's where you want your small trees and shrubs. And then in the understory, you're going to be planting the perennials and ground cover. So it's a very rich in terms of structural diversity in the garden. And that's, so in a small space, you can really get a lot of different diversity of native plants in a small garden. So that's our black-throated blue warbler. So in addition to all the food that you would be providing, thinking about habitat, a water source is really good to consider in your native plant garden. Especially in the winter, when things are frozen, it's hard for birds to find. It takes a lot of energy for birds to find water, and if they're eating snow or things like that, it takes energy to melt that snow. And so providing water, especially moving water, can be really essential for their survival. And it doesn't take a whole lot, just a trickle of water can make a big difference for birds out there. The other thing to think about is shelter and nesting sites for birds. And here's a wood thrush hiding in this rhododendron here. And broadleaf, as well as needle evergreen trees, provide a lot more shelter throughout the winter, which is, like I said, on a night like tonight, makes you think about those birds hunkering down. So some of our native conifers are the eastern red cedar, the juniper. Our native pine species are the red pine, the pitch pine, and the eastern pine. We also have the white and the red spruce, balsam fir, eastern hemlock, northern white cedar, and the tamarack. White pine, did I not say white? Eastern white is what I said. That's what happened. The other thing you can do is leave a brush pile if you have a garden that's big enough, or even if you have I have this very small garden. Like my garden is about the size of this room, and there's room for a brush pile because that's a great place for birds to take shelter when they're feeding, and they can go hide. It's also a wonderful place for birds to forage down in the leaf litter here. And it doesn't have to be, like building one. It doesn't have to be fancy construction. Just thinking about there's spaces for birds to hide, and there are good places for them to perch as well. So speaking about the leaf litter, I know in the springtime in my yard we get white-throated sparrows coming through very early, and they're down in the leaf litter, and that's where they're finding all of the insects, seeds that have been, or rather eggs that have been overwintering. So it's a really rich source of food down there in that leaf litter. So something like this is also going to provide great pollinator habitat as well. So if you have a large enough property and it's safe for you to leave dead trees that are standing, I would encourage you to keep those snags out there. Great source of food for insects, as well as for nesting sites, for woodpeckers, owls, tree swallows, chickadees. It's a wonderful, wonderful resource for birds out there. But if you don't have a tree, property that's big enough for the snags, you can also create those cavities with bird boxing, nesting boxes. And plants for birds can happen on any scale, in an urban environment, in a more suburban environment, on a larger landscape scale. So this is a very small garden here, and Patterson Art Park Audubon Center, this garden has 50% of their patio plants are in native plants right here. And as I was alluding to at the very beginning of my talk about policy, when you work together, you can really have a big impact. So this is the Backyard Habitat Certification Program. You could do something like that in your community where you really, I've got over on the left here is the Plants for Birds sign. So it can really help raise awareness about what you're doing in your garden, and then having other folks recognize that and join that movement. So in summary, for a bird-friendly lard, you're going to need those native plants, those layers of habitat, that source of water, and those sheltering and nest sites. And when you have a bird-friendly garden, it's also going to be climate-friendly. It's going to be directly reducing greenhouse gas emissions because you're not going to be mowing as much of your lawn. You're not going to be needing to use as much fertilizer because those plants were bred to be survive here on their own without fertilizer. It's going to increase carbon storage, especially over lawn. And it's going to build resiliency in our landscape for when climate change happens. And so, getting back to the climate, the survival by degrees report from Audubon, we were looking at, so reducing that warming scenario from 3 degrees to 1.5 degrees, it's actually going to benefit 3/4 of our most vulnerable species. And 38% of the species could come off that climate vulnerable list. And really taking climate action today is going to make a better chance for birds. And planting plants for birds is one of those steps. But we also have actions we can take together in our communities and politically. So as individuals, we can be reducing our use of energy at home, as well as supporting our legislatures to demand energy-saving policies so that demand in electricity is going down. We can expand our consumer-driven clean energy development, and which also will grow jobs in our community. You already know how to do what you can to reduce the amount of carbon released into the atmosphere. And then advocating for natural solutions, such as maintaining healthy carbon-storing forests. So you'll see that in the legislature, and we'll be communicating with you folks. I do the communications at Audubon, and so look for those action alerts to let you know when legislation is going to be happening to help support those carbon-storing forests. There's a loon. They really do that. So making our landscape climate resilient means really diversifying that habitat in your yard, using native plants in our homes and our communities, and then also managing if you have forest land, managing those forests with birds in mind. So we have our Forest Bird Initiative. I imagine you've heard of that, where we're really looking at how to create a forest that has the structure and the structural diversity as well as the species diversity to support birds as they. Vermont is going to be a place where other birds that can no longer survive in the climate that they were used to, we're going to be a refugia for those birds. And so anything that we can do to make our landscape more resilient, it's going to be helping out the bird populations. So I wanted to spend a little time looking at the Native Plants for Birds database. So that's on the National Audubon website. And I had the honor of working with National Audubon to help develop this and really making sure that all the lists for Vermont were right. Also coming up, helping them know about where we can find native plants to buy, because that's the other side of the coin that is a little tricky. So you would go to the Plants for Birds website, enter your email address and your zip code, and it will generate a list of native plants that are specific to where you live. And then once you get in there, there's hundreds and hundreds of native plants, of course. So you can narrow down your search. The first way you can narrow it down is by the type of plant. So I was talking to someone earlier about wanting to plant a mixed a shrub hedge. So you could just click that shrub box right there, and it's just going to tell you which native shrubs are native here in Vermont. The next thing that if you'd like to look for are those plant resources. So if you really want to support the caterpillars, check that caterpillar box, and then it's going to focus in on those plants that are particularly strong as host species for caterpillars. And then the third thing that you can sort by is the type of bird. And there's tons of different categories because this is Audubon, right? So there's probably 15 different types of birds that you can decide to sort by there. You know, so if you're looking for woodpeckers, it's going to be very different kinds of native plants than if you're looking for finches. Yep, so down there on the right, you can see just the start of the list of the types of birds. So this is, when you come up with a list, this is a little trickier to get to. So you'll see the third tab over there is local resources. So when you click on that local resources tab, it's going to come up with a list of where you can buy native plants here in Vermont. And if you know of any places that are good sources for native plants, please let me know, and I can have that added right into the database. So how's that list looking to you folks? Rockydale, yeah. No, they're good people too. And actually, when I did this talk earlier, I'm not sure the Winooski Conservation District. You're not in the Winooski watershed down here, but you have a conservation district, and most of the conservation districts in Vermont have a tree sale, and so in the springtime, and they're really focused on native plants. This year, the Winooski Conservation District came to Audubon Vermont and asked us to recommend native plants that were particularly good for bird, and making sure that it's a selection of plants that will sustain birds over every season. So if you go to their website, you can order it. You don't have to live in the Winooski watershed to do that. So that's a really great source of trees and shrubs. And then, wait a second. The Intervale Conservation Nursery is my personal favorite. They're right down in Burlington's Intervale, and they grow their own native plants. So it's not just native to Vermont, it's the actual genotypes that are specifically evolved right here. So they go out and they take cuttings in the winter, they collect seeds. So it's a really great organization, wonderful partner for Audubon. And down near you, the Vermont Wetland Supply Company also grows their own right here in Vermont, and that's in Orwell. So again, the way you get there is through that local resources tab when you go in, and it generates your list. Oh, and then the other thing I wanted to highlight, I don't know if you folks are familiar with the Wild Seed Project. Heather McCargo out in Maine runs this project, and it's all about how to grow native plants from seeds. So there's a lot of wonderful resources online for that. And that is the end of my talk. So if folks have any questions, you're most welcome. Yes, I love that part of the yard. So the question is, for the part of the yard that you're not going to garden, that you know. Okay. I live in Burlington. Absolutely. I was going to say, clover is wonderful for insects. Yes, absolutely. The white clover. White clover is absolutely fine. Yep, white clover. There's red clover. There's what's the yellow one? Medic, bird's foot clover. Trefoil. Yes, that's the yellow one. And then there's one that looks like a rabbit foot. That's so cute. It's so fuzzy. And then you can also mix in native seeds as well. Okay. You can make those edges just like creep in and creep in, creep in. Yep. Yeah, I live right in Burlington, and like what's socially acceptable is like I'm making new standards for that. There's no more grass out there. There was nothing but grass when I moved into my house 25 years ago, and now there's just like these little islands of grass that are really awkward to mow. Yeah, it takes its process. Yes, right here. Mm-hmm. I was at a talk. They said American Meadows in Shelburne, which is a relatively new place. It's not on the database yet. So I haven't actually gone to suss it out to see, if it's truly Vermont native, but that might be a good source. The one that's, and you're looking for seed, right? So Prairie Moon Nursery out in Minnesota has a wonderful selection of seed. Prairie Moon Nursery. They would. I mean, ideally you would want to get the seeds from Vermont, but sourcing isn't great, and it's better to have native plants in your garden than to have exotic. So, yes. That's a good question. I had a question the other day about whether it's okay to spray for 10 caterpillars. That's an easier question. The answer is no. Because they will bounce back from the 10 caterpillars. Yeah, but right. I don't think so. Not that I know of. Cuckoos? Thank you. I knew that was okay. There aren't very many cuckoos around. Cuckoo. Yeah. We do in Vermont, but yep. I'm actually more of a plant person than a bird person, so it's very handy. They have all the Audubon people in the audience. Any other questions? Yes. Oh. Yeah. That'll happen. Yes, you should. Oh, it feels so good. Yes, cut it down. Because it's just going to make seed, and then it's going to be, my next door neighbor planted a Norway maple next to me, I'm just pulling the little seedlings out every year. Yep. It's all right. It's a safe space. They will, yeah, the birds will come and they'll eat the seeds right out of the zinnia heads. So, but in the compost pile, they'll come and they'll find them too. But it's gonna be easiest for the birds to find if you leave them standing in the garden. So, it's another year. Yeah, it's great. Yeah, and I gave this talk over the summer to a garden club, and one thing I think I didn't mention is just these small steps. You don't have to transform your whole garden to a native plant garden like this summer, right? So next time you go and you buy a plant, buy a native plant. Or next time you need to replace a plant, maybe think about that one that's an exotic. Well, get the invasives out first. But if it's an exotic, it's not doing that well because they're not bred to be here. Replace it with a native plant. So over time, you just gradually transform your garden. Or you can go big right away. That's good too. Yes. Did you say Andromeda? I'm not familiar with Andromeda. So good for cover. Is it you've stumped the botanist. I might. That's probably the Latin name though, which I'll talk to you after. Yes. Yeah, and there are some that are native to Vermont, but even the ones that are ornamental grasses, a lot of them have seeds that are edible. So yes, they do provide a good food value in the garden. thank you very much for coming out on such a cold night. And please take materials, and if you have any questions, I'll be around to talk about your garden. If you haven't been to our website, vt.audubon.org is our website, and we've got lots of events coming up and other resources.